Well, all the pomp and pageantry you'd expect was rolled out this morning for the Queen's speech, intended to set out the government's plans for the coming session. But what coming session? The government doesn't have a majority, is desperate for a general election, and thinks Parliament is dead. The speech itself might well be voted down. So Jeremy Corbyn dismissed it as a farcical propaganda exercise. And on the key issue of Brexit, the Queen did not say the UK would be leaving the EU on October 31st. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is with me, and some breaking news from the talks that suggest we might not be.
The Queen might have been onto something, yes. The Finnish Prime Minister, Finland holds the presidency of the EU at the moment, has just said that there are no practical or legal ways to find agreement on Brexit before this week's summit. We need more time. Now, this throws Boris Johnson's timing. He was hoping that there could be agreement tied up at the European Council summit, ready for a vote on Saturday in the House of Commons. Special sitting, of course, doesn't happen very often. Those timings now look extremely challenged, to put it politely. As you were saying, this was, though, the day of pomp and pageantry, and that tells you what Boris Johnson also thinks the election, which is coming towards us at some point, is going to be about. Not just Brexit, he thinks, but he can only win if he puts a focus on the domestic agenda as well and tries to convince the country that he cares about the NHS. He'll pump money into that and other public services, and he owns what he sees as the middle ground of politics, albeit with some tough messages on crime, which he thinks also belong in that centre ground. So he sort of commandeered the pageantry of the Queen's speech to try and turn the focus onto this domestic agenda. It is one of the perks of office. He hasn't got many others, like being able to win votes or anything like that. So he uses this one, and boy, did he use it today.
The government put Parliament's full pomp on display, even as it plots to run a people versus Parliament election. This Queen's speech didn't grip Westminster. No one thinks this government can implement most of it, 45 short of a majority in the Commons, with other institutions frustrating its will too. The real action was elsewhere in Brussels, where officials are trying to scrape together a last-minute deal with the deadline only days away. The Queen could be forgiven for being confused. The opposition claimed she was being dragooned into a party political broadcast.
My government's priority has always been to secure the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union on the 31st of October.
It's government by theatre. I mean, this is a government that hasn't got a majority. This is not a programme for government. This was a manifesto which they got the Queen to recite.
Some of the most prominent measures promised matched the 2016 Vote Leave campaign pledges. A new post-Brexit immigration system based on the Australian point system, more spending on the NHS. There was also a tough-on-crime message which the Tories intend to put centre stage in the election campaign.
The Prime Minister promised that this Queen's speech would dazzle us. On closer inspection, Mr. Speaker, it is nothing more than fool's gold.
It's our job as a campaigning government to level up investment across the nation. And I'm proud now that we are seeing the biggest programme of investment in the NHS for a generation.
Like the Vote Leave bus, Boris Johnson wants to wrap himself in the NHS logo. Attention kept switching, though, to Brussels and the progress on the UK's last-minute proposals to keep Northern Ireland in the UK customs union, but in effect behaving like it was still in the EU customs union. Under the partnership approach, cars imported into Britain from the US at zero tariff under a free trade agreement would then have to pay the EU 10% tariff if they were heading into Northern Ireland, even though Northern Ireland would not technically be in the EU customs union. If one of the cars stayed put in Northern Ireland, the supplier could get a refund on the tariff. If the other car went on into Ireland and the EU, the tariff paid in Britain would be passed on by the UK authorities to the EU. One of Theresa May's Brexit negotiating team worries that Boris Johnson's number 10 may have focused too late on the compromise plan for it all to be nailed down in time for this week's summit and Saturday's planned Commons vote.
If we had put forward these proposals 2 months ago, we might be in a different place.
Why didn't we, do you think?
Well, I think it's very hard to say. These were proposals which had been worked up internally in government previously. I worked on them when I was in government over the past 3 years. So it is hard to understand why the government didn't look at them. But
some people would say it's because the government was too focused on no deal and didn't really think this was worth the effort.
Well, it's entirely possible that was the case.
The SNP said the government's hopes of kicking off a withdrawal agreement bill with a Commons vote this Saturday was unrealistic.
Announcing on Monday a bill on an agreement that doesn't exist and expecting it to pass through this House on Saturday. Mr. Speaker, what recklessness!
Having been involved in many of the previous decisive weeks, I think there is a very good chance it is not the final decisive week, and there will be more to come.
Did the Northern Ireland Secretary know what switched Number 10's focus so late in the day?
It was said the Prime Minister became more focused on getting a deal once he had security briefings about the threat to Northern Ireland from no deal. Is that right?
I'm not going to go into those sorts of briefings, but what I do know is that I support the Prime Minister fully in getting a deal. That's in the best interest of Northern Ireland and, in my view, the best interest of the United Kingdom.
You're off resignation watch now.
I've never been on it.
A week after the state opening of Parliament, after 6 days of debating the Queen's speech, MPs normally vote to thank the monarch for coming to address them. But her current government looks like continuing its 100% record of losing votes and won't win that one either. It's already been denied an early general election which was supposed to happen tomorrow and carries on nearly powerless as it waits on a deal it can't be sure will happen.
Well, just around the corner from here, the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is addressing a Labour rally. And from there, I'm joined by his colleague from the Shadow Cabinet, Laura Pidcock. Laura Pidcock, there are two things that could happen this week. Boris Johnson could get a deal or not get a deal. If he doesn't get a deal and has to trigger a delay, will you then immediately go for the general election that he wants?
Sorry, I didn't catch the tail end of what you said there.
My question was, if there is a delay to the Brexit process, if the Benn Act kicks in, will you immediately then try to trigger a general election as Boris Johnson wants?
Well, you know, it's just so hypothetical. We do not trust Boris Johnson at all. We don't know the details of any deal. We don't know what will be put before us. There's been some deals coming back and forward. We have been very clear as a political party. Our conference decided that actually we do want a general election as soon as possible once no deal is taken off the table.
Will you trigger it?
Once no deal is taken off the table. I'm not going to engage in hypothetical scenarios. You know as well as I do, it's very difficult to ascertain the Prime Minister's next move because this is games and more games with Boris Johnson, and actually we are concerned about real people's lives. And that's why, to be honest, I was so disappointed in the Queen's speech today.
Hang on, I mean, you've already engaged in hypothetical scenarios. The Benn Act is all about a hypothetical scenario in which there is no deal and you need more time. So
no, I think that was legislated for something that
are you going to go? Hang on, let me get the question.
Hang on, that wasn't a hypothetical scenario. That was us legislating for what the Prime Minister has said they are willing to put to the nation. They are willing to come out without a deal.
I'm asking you a simple question.
And we have said we needed to legislate
about when the general election is going to be triggered.
It will be triggered as soon as we can make sure we are not crashing out of the European Union. Do you think that I don't want to go to my constituents with this amazing radical agenda? Of course I do, but I also don't want to the farmers that I represent to take the hit on tariffs. You know, they rely on exporting sheep meat, and you know, I represent an area that has a dairy farm. We have to absolutely make sure that no deal isn't a reality, and I cannot trust this Prime Minister one bit. Or you saw absolutely no detail, nothing in the Queen's speech today that would actually help the people that I represent. This was parliamentary games. I'm not going to engage in that. I want to see what happens this week. I want to see what the Prime Minister comes back with. And as soon as we are able to go to the people, where we are not committing economic suicide for many of the sectors in this nation and many of the regions, then we will have that general election.
If he gets a deal and that comes back to Parliament and he's got support for that deal in Parliament, will you, the Labour Party, try to get a referendum on that deal before you go for a general election?
We've always said that the people should have the final say. It was decided at our conference. That is absolutely clear, that after all this time negotiating, there should be a credible leave option, and that should be set against remain. When we have a general election is about when we can take off the table.
Yeah, it's what comes first.
It's as simple as that.
Could the referendum come first?
I think we need a general election. I do not want to keep the Tories in power for one day longer. And with the Labour Party in government, people would get a referendum. They would get a final say on all of these political shenanigans. They would have a credible leave option on the table set against remain. I would prefer a general election. And with the Labour Party,
so you
will
disagree
also
with
get in
Rebecca
government a
Long-Bailey
referendum and that final say.
others.
And done within 6 months. And I think these, trying to create these really tiring divisions. We have had a Queen's speech today that said absolutely nothing about the 14 million people in poverty. 4.3 million of those people are children. We are serious, and in my department we are serious. You might not want to hear it, but we are serious about eradicating in-work poverty and child poverty. That's what I care about, not about indulging in what splits there might be in the Labour Party. This is gossip, and it's not helpful, and it's not helpful about the eradication.
It's not gossip, it's on the record. But Laura Pidcock, thank you very much indeed for joining us. The Conservative MP Bim Athalami is with me now. What was the point of today when you don't have a majority to get this Queen's speech through? I mean, it was a joke.
Well, it's about setting out the government's agenda. We've set out exactly what it is we'll do, and we will be introducing those bills. They won't just be left; they will be introduced. And if the Labour Party and opposition
parties... You don't have a
parties,
majority.
well, of course, but we are a minority government, and we wanted to give the people a chance to elect a parliament that could actually deliver things, and the Labour Party, as you know very well, blocked that. So it is incumbent upon us to govern, and if the Labour Party wants to vote against more money for the NHS, or vote against a new agriculture bill, or vote against more money for schools, then they can do that, and then the people of this country will see that when we eventually do get to a general election.
Which of these bills couldn't you have brought forward without a new Queen's speech?
Well, it is normal, as you know, we had the longest parliamentary session in the post-war era.
But you didn't need a Queen's speech, did you?
Well, you do need a Queen's speech.
You could have brought any of these bills to Parliament without a Queen's speech.
Well, look, it is normal under our constitutional framework to have a Queen's speech, roughly speaking, every year or so. We had 2 years since the last session. It's right to refresh the agenda and say, look, this is what we want as our agenda for the country going forward.
So it was about messaging. I mean, were you not really a bit embarrassed, having forced the Queen into this unlawful prorogation, to then drag her here and make her read out this speech that will probably be defeated? You won't have time to put any of these before there's a general election, will you?
Well, I'm not sure we're going to get a general election anytime soon, because the Labour Party is determined to try and stop one. And it's important that we lay out our agenda going forward. I don't think anybody sitting at home thinks, well, the government's talked about how it's going to invest more in the NHS, or government's talked about how it's going to sort out our agriculture. But no, because they had a Queen's speech, I don't like it. I think that people want to see work done. This Parliament is frankly broken. We don't have a majority, you're quite right. So we are doing our very best
if it's broken,
to govern. No.
The idea of a legislative agenda and a Queen's speech is a farce.
Well,
because you have no government majority to put through any of these bills.
Well, look, it is factually accurate. We do not have a majority. Everybody knows that. But the point is, we still have to put before our agenda to the people and to Parliament. And if Parliament wants to vote down sensible piece of legislation, then ultimately the people will judge them for that.
Bim Athalami, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you. John.
Krishnan, thank you. From Westminster to protest in Catalonia. The former president of Spain's Catalonia region has condemned the long prison sentences handed down to leaders of the 2017 separatist movement, calling them unfair, inhumane. Carles Puigdemont fled to Belgium 2 years ago and is now the subject of an international arrest warrant. Crowds of pro-independent supporters have clashed with riot police in Barcelona's airport as they protested against the verdicts. Simon Brown has this report.
This is a country now in conflict with itself. On the right are the citizens of Catalonia, lined up against the might of the state. Spain's constitutional crisis is again playing out on the streets. Go away, says this policeman. but Catalan dissent shows no signs of going anywhere. These pictures are from Barcelona airport, under siege from an act of mass civil disobedience.
It's up to you. Do you want it or not?
Thousands have descended on the airport in protest. Today, a dozen Catalan politicians and activists were sentenced to 9 to 13 years in prison for their roles in the push for independence. This is the man at the centre of the charges. Carles Puigdemont, speaking in Brussels, is the former Catalonia president, now the subject of a fresh arrest warrant.
The great decision of the Spanish justice system marks the dawn of a new era in which exercising fundamental rights and freedoms will be restricted to all citizens.
But this is what Spain's Prime Minister had to say.
Nobody is above the law. Nobody is above the law. In a democracy like Spain, nobody is subject to trial for his or her ideas or politics, but rather for criminal conduct as provided by the law.
But this is the side of anger against that law. Many believe the law is being misused for political ends against the democratic movement. And the kickback has begun. In a region that has long debated whether it wanted to be a part of Spain, what impact would the imprisonment of their leaders and a squadron of police batons have on uniting this country?
Now, the parents of 19-year-old Harry Dunn say the American suspect in the crash, which caused his death, should return to the UK to face justice, saying it's the right thing to do. And Sakoulis fled to the United States shortly after the accident outside a military base in Northamptonshire. Harry Dunn's parents have been speaking to reporters in New York. Danny Isdale is there. Danny.
Well, it's been a really difficult day for the Dunn family, another one after 7 weeks of pain following the death of their son Harry and confusion over the events that followed. The suspected driver that hit Harry is American Anne Sarkoulis. She left the UK after the crash with diplomatic immunity, or so the Dunn family thought at the time. They were notified by the Foreign Office this weekend that she does not have diplomatic immunity. So where does that leave the Dunn family? Well, bewildered, and it's in that frame of mind about where it leaves them legally that they've arrived here in the US to lobby to American viewers and the press here that Anne Sarkoulis should return to the UK. Charlotte Charles and Tim Dunn appeared on breakfast television here this morning. They said they want to meet with Anne Sarkoulis, but not here in the US, in the UK, in a controlled environment with therapists present. Ms Sarkoulis reached out to them this weekend for the first time, saying that she is devastated and extends her deepest sympathies through her lawyers. Her lawyers say she did cooperate fully with police and the investigation. We spoke with the Dunn family here in Manhattan a little earlier today.
Charlotte, you have suffered indescribably, that suffering compounded by Anne Sarkoulis' departure. Do you feel you've suffered unnecessarily because of the actions of either the US authorities or the UK Foreign Office? What should they have done differently for you?
Not let her go home. You know, whoever made that decision, we do not know. But we shouldn't have gone through this. We shouldn't be suffering like this. It should have been an open and shut case. The evidence is extremely clear.
What do you want to hear from the UK police or the Foreign Office? What do you want the next development to be announced?
We just want to know that she's being brought back to the UK. You know, that would be a huge step in the right direction. It's the only right thing to do. It's the only humane thing to do. It was an accident, we understand that. But 7 weeks on, and we've had to do this to get an apology, just in writing.
Well, beyond Ms Sarkoulis, Tim Dunn, Harry's father, told us that someone has made a mistake, and he wants answers from the Foreign Office in the UK about the torture of the back and forth of this immunity issue, and answers from US officials here as well. That search for answers will take the family to DC later this week, where they want to meet with Donald Trump. Tim Dunn says he wants the president to personally intervene, father to father.
Danny Isdale in New York. Tributes have been paid at the funeral of PC Andrew Harper. He was killed as he responded to a burglary in Berkshire back in August. The Dean of Christ Church Cathedral told hundreds of mourners that the officer had represented policing at its best, describing him as brave, genuine and kind. 3 teenagers have been charged with his murder and conspiracy to steal a quad bike. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent, Simon Israel, has this.